My parents looked straight at me across the kitchen table, their voices low but sharp enough to cut through the air like glass. "On your brother's wedding day," my mother said, not even blinking. "It's better if you're not there." And then they both smirked, like they'd been waiting for this moment their whole lives, like humiliating me was some kind of family tradition. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the sting in my eyes, but I didn't flinch. Not this time. Because one thing they didn't know was that I'd already uncovered the kind of secret that doesn't just ruin a wedding, it destroys the perfect little image they'd spent decades building. And while they thought I'd walk away quietly, ashamed and obedient like always, I was already planning exactly how to make sure that when my brother said I do, the spotlight wouldn't be on him, or on their picture-perfect lies, but on me, and on the truth they never thought I'd dare to speak. I sat in silence that night, the words echoing in my head, over and over. "It's better if you're not there." I wanted to scream, to ask them how they could so easily erase me, their own daughter, from one of the biggest days in our family. But instead, I stayed still, because when you've lived your whole life being told you're not enough, you learn that silence can be louder than anything. Growing up, my brother was the golden boy. He never heard the word no. Every achievement of his was paraded around like a trophy, while mine were brushed aside, as if they were accidents. When I graduated with honors, my mom barely looked up from her phone. When my brother passed a basic exam, she threw a dinner party with balloons. That was the rhythm of my life, him at the center, me in the shadows. And still, I tried to love them. I tried to be the daughter they never saw. But there comes a point when the mask cracks, when you see your family not as family, but as people willing to wound you just to keep their illusion intact. That wedding was supposed to be my breaking point. They wanted me hidden away like some dirty secret, because my existence didn't fit the image of perfection they wanted to display to the world. They didn't want whispers about me, about the fact that I wasn't married yet, that I had chosen a different path, that I wasn't bending to their traditions. They wanted silence, but I wasn't going to give it to them. Because months before that wedding, I had stumbled across something that made their smiles feel like poison. A letter, tucked away in a drawer my father thought no one opened anymore. The handwriting wasn't his, but the words were intimate, almost desperate. And the name signed at the bottom wasn't my mother's. I froze, reread it a dozen times, felt my stomach twist into knots. Suddenly the years of coldness of being pushed aside made a cruel kind of sense. Their marriage wasn't as pure as they wanted the world to believe, and I had proof. For weeks, I carried that letter folded in my bag, like a weapon, like an insurance policy. I didn't know when I'd use it, but I knew the day would come. And when my mother told me not to show my face at that wedding, I realized she had handed me the perfect stage. The days leading up to the wedding felt like walking through a storm with no umbrella. Every conversation dripping with contempt, every look a reminder that I was unwanted. My mother made sure to forget to send me updates about the event. I only learned the date had been moved up by overhearing my aunt on the phone. My father walked past me in the hall like I was invisible, only stopping to say that it's best for everyone if you keep a low profile. Everyone. That word tasted bitter. Everyone meant their friends, their reputation, their social standing. Everyone did not include me. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't sitting still anymore. I had been piecing together every little detail, every transaction, every receipt that crossed my father's desk when he carelessly left things lying around. He thought I wasn't paying attention, but I had been my entire life, just waiting for a reason. And now I had one. My brother's fiancée, Clara, was sweet in public, but I saw the cracks. She played the role of the graceful bride-to-be, but behind closed doors, she was restless, calculating. I caught her once at a cafe downtown, hand brushing against another man's as she whispered something that made him laugh in a way my brother never could. I didn't take a photo that day. I wanted to. But something told me to wait, that the truth always grows legs if you give it time. A week later, it wasn't just whispers. I found her name connected to a luxury boutique receipt charged to my brother's credit card, but the signature for pickup wasn't hers. It was the same man's. Different handwriting, same initials. I tucked that away with the letter from my father's drawer. One secret was survival. Two secrets meant power. And all the while, my parents continued to push me further out, not knowing that every cruel word they hurled was cementing my resolve. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I sat at my desk with the letter, the receipt, and the unanswered text from my brother, who hadn't even bothered to ask why I wasn't invited to stand by his side. I felt the weight of every year I had been their scapegoat, their afterthought. I had begged for their love as a child. I had bent myself into shapes they would never notice. But I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to bend. I was going to break the image they worshipped. And I knew exactly how. At the wedding, in front of their friends, in front of the family that never once defended me, I would hand the truth back to them. Not in rage, not in screams, but in silence so heavy it would suffocate. I wasn't planning on ruining their day. I was planning on reclaiming mine. So when the morning came, and the house buzzed with last-minute panic, I walked out of my room in a dress they hadn't chosen, with my head higher than it had ever been. My mother's face went pale when she saw me. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed. I smiled softly, almost politely. "Don't worry," I said. "I won't stay long." Just long enough. And in that moment, I think she understood. I wasn't coming as the forgotten daughter anymore. I was coming as the reckoning they never thought I had the strength to become. The church was wrapped in flowers and silk, the kind of excess my parents lived for, the kind of spectacle they believed proved their worth. Guests filed in, all polished smiles and shallow compliments, the same people who had looked at me my whole life as though I was an unfinished version of my brother. I walked slowly, deliberately, heels clicking against the stone floor, feeling every eye shift toward me. For once the whispers didn't sting, they fueled me. I took my seat in the back row, where they had hoped I'd disappear, but I wasn't disappearing anymore. My mother's eyes darted to my father's, a silent exchange of panic, but neither dared to cause a scene with so many people watching. The ceremony began, all the usual vows and promises, the bride in her white gown glowing under the vaulted ceiling lights, my brother beaming like he had already won the world. But I knew what sat beneath that glow. I knew the truth neither of them wanted to face, and the weight of it burned in my bag like a loaded gun. I waited because timing is everything. Not during the vows, not during the kiss. That would have been too easy, too explosive, too much about revenge and not enough about clarity. I wanted the silence afterward, the lull when people believed the story was complete. I wanted to cut the curtain when they thought the show was over. When the reception began, the hall sparkled with chandeliers, the sound of clinking glasses filling the air. I let them enjoy it for a moment. Let them laugh and dance. Let my parents bask in the illusion that they had finally sealed their perfect legacy. And then I stood. I raised my glass, calm and steady, and said words I never thought I'd hear myself say aloud. "I'd like to toast my family." My mother froze, her smile stiffening. My father's hand gripped his glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. I looked straight at my brother, his new wife by his side, and I saw it then. The flicker of guilt in her eyes when she realized what was coming. "To my brother," I began, voice steady, "who deserves honesty even if it hurts, and to my parents, who taught me what honesty isn't." I pulled the folded receipt from my bag and placed it gently on the table in front of him. Gasps rippled through the room. I didn't explain, didn't raise my voice, just let the paper speak for itself. His fiancée reached for it with trembling fingers, but he snatched it first, scanning the lines, his jaw tightening as he recognized the name, the signature. The silence spread like wildfire. Then, before anyone could react, I laid the second weapon down, the letter from my father's drawer. I didn't hand it to him, didn't point it out. I simply placed it beside the glass, turned, and began to walk away. Behind me, I heard voices rising. My mother's sharp hiss, my father's frantic murmur, my brother's voice cracking as he demanded answers. The bride reached for his arm, but he pulled it away. I didn't need to stay to see the collapse. I had delivered the truth, and the truth had a way of finishing what it started. Outside, the night air hit me like freedom, cool and unyielding. For the first time in my life, I wasn't weighed down by their expectations or crushed under their judgment. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was the one who had pulled back the curtain, who had dared to hold up a mirror to the family that always wanted me gone. And though I walked away alone, I wasn't broken. I was free. The aftermath began before I even reached the end of the church steps, because chaos doesn't wait for permission. My phone buzzed nonstop, messages flooding in from relatives who had spent years ignoring me, but suddenly needed my version of the truth. I didn't answer any of them. I just walked, heels in hand now, the night echoing with a silence that felt heavier than applause. Behind me, through the grand doors, I could hear it unraveling, the raised voices, the shuffle of footsteps, the gasps when secrets too long buried clawed their way into the open. I had thought maybe I would feel guilt. Maybe I would second-guess the way I had laid their empire bare, but instead I felt only clarity. For the first time, I wasn't the one being erased. They were erasing themselves with the lies they had chosen. By the time I got home, social media was already moving faster than any rumor mill could. A cousin had filmed part of the toast, and though they couldn't capture the documents, the tension in the room was undeniable. "Something went down at the wedding," the caption read, and it didn't take long before speculation turned to frenzy. Guests leaked fragments of what they had seen, the bride storming out with tears streaking her perfect makeup, my father arguing with an uncle in the courtyard, my mother pale and shaking as though someone had pulled the ground from under her, and my brother, the golden child, suddenly looked less like a groom and more like a man who had been played by everyone he trusted. He tried to call me again and again, but I let it ring. What was there left to say? He had stood by while they diminished me, had basked in the love and attention that should have been shared, and only now, when his world cracked, did he see me as a sister worth reaching for. The irony wasn't lost on me. By midnight, my father's business partners had heard whispers, and I knew the letter would do more than damage his marriage. It would raise questions about his judgment, his integrity, the very foundation of the deals he had built. Because when a man pretends to be flawless and the mask slips even once, the people who trusted him start to wonder what else is a lie. My mother, who spent her life crafting the perfect image of family, suddenly faced a truth she couldn't Photoshop away. And the bride, well, she didn't even last the weekend. By Sunday, her car was gone from their driveway, her ring left behind on the table. The receipt had been the final straw, the undeniable proof that her fairy tale had another man written between the lines. And my brother, stripped of his golden aura, had to face the truth without me to soften it for him. People told me I had destroyed a wedding. I disagreed. I had revealed one. I hadn't broken their happiness. I had exposed the hollow shell they had been parading as love and loyalty. And though they might never forgive me, forgiveness wasn't something I needed from them anymore. Standing in my apartment window that night, looking out at the city lights, I realized something I had never dared to admit to myself before. Maybe being the unwanted daughter was the best gift they ever gave me. Because in their rejection, I had found a strength they would never understand. And in their cruelty, I had learned that silence is a weapon only if you let them hold it. And I had finally taken it back. The days that followed felt like watching a storm tear through a house I'd been locked outside of my whole life. Only now the windows were wide open and I could see everything collapse from the safety of distance. My brother didn't stop calling. At first it was angry voicemails, his voice sharp with betrayal, accusing me of ruining the happiest day of his life. Then the tone shifted to desperation, pleading for me to talk, to explain, to fix what I had broken, as if it had ever been my responsibility to carry the weight of their lies. I ignored them all, because the truth doesn't need defending. It just sits there, heavy and undeniable, and eventually it crushes the people who tried to hide it. My parents were more predictable. My mother showed up at my door 3 days later. Her perfect composure fractured, mascara smudged beneath her eyes in a way I'd never seen before. She didn't knock politely. She pounded, shouting my name as though she could still command me into obedience. I didn't open. I stood behind the door, listening as she hissed through the wood. Do you realize what you've done? You've destroyed this family. I wanted to laugh, because what family was there left to destroy? A family that mocked me, erased me, told me I was unworthy of standing beside them? No, all I had done was strip away the mask. My father tried a different tactic. He sent an email, formal and cold, telling me I had embarrassed him, that business associates were asking questions, that I needed to rectify the misunderstanding before it caused permanent damage. Permanent damage. The phrase felt almost poetic. I read it twice, then closed my laptop without replying, because nothing I could say would undo the truth, and for once, I didn't want to undo it. Meanwhile, the wider circle of relatives split into factions. Some called me brave, finally standing up to years of cruelty. Others called me vindictive, jealous, bitter. Let them. Opinions don't rewrite facts. The documents I laid down on that table were real, and they would continue to unravel everything, no matter how many people whispered or judged. The bride's family, furious and humiliated, pulled back from any association with mine. The lavish gifts they had exchanged were returned, the honeymoon tickets canceled, the entire marriage dissolved before it could legally begin. And my brother, once the golden child everyone worshipped, suddenly found himself alone in a spotlight that burned instead of flattered. He called me again one night, his voice raw, saying he needed to know why I hadn't just kept my mouth shut, why I had to destroy everything. I almost answered. For a moment, I almost broke the silence. But then I remembered that night at the kitchen table, my parents' mocking voices, the way he sat there and let them cut me down without a word. He never defended me. He never saw me as his sister when it mattered. And now he wanted explanations? No, I owed him nothing. As weeks passed, the ripple effects deepened. My father's business contracts began to stall, partners hesitating to sign with a man whose name was suddenly attached to scandal. My mother withdrew from her social circles, unable to bear the whispers that followed her at every luncheon. Their empire, so carefully built on appearances, was crumbling. And through it all, I felt something I had never felt before in connection to them. Distance. The kind of distance that wasn't about being excluded, but about finally stepping outside of their cage. And as I watched it all unravel, I realized this was only the beginning. The collapse didn't come all at once. It came in waves, like the tide dragging out everything they had tried to anchor. At first it was gossip, the kind that spreads through small towns and elite circles faster than fire. Then came the scrutiny, the questions from people outside the family who smelled weakness and circled like vultures. Business partners quietly pulled out of deals with my father, citing instability. Invitations to my mother's endless charity galas stopped arriving, as if her presence was now toxic to the image of perfection those events thrived on. And my brother, once adored and envied, now had pity in the eyes of everyone who saw him. He tried to rebuild by pretending nothing had happened, posting cheerful photos, surrounding himself with friends who fed him the lies he needed. But the truth lingered like smoke. Everyone could still smell the fire. I should have felt satisfied, but the strangest part was that satisfaction wasn't the emotion that settled in me. It was clarity. For the first time, I wasn't drowning under their approval or gasping for scraps of attention. I was breathing freely, watching from a distance as they lived in the wreckage of the walls they had built. And yet they still came for me. My father appeared at my work one morning, polished as ever in his tailored suit. But the lines in his face were deeper now, his charm worn thin. "He didn't ask to see me," he demanded. My coworkers exchanged glances, whispering curious. I stepped into the hallway, arms crossed, and for once I wasn't the one shrinking. He said I had humiliated him, that I had crossed a line no daughter should cross. His voice was sharp, but underneath it was fear, the kind of fear that comes when a man realizes control has slipped through his fingers. "Do you even understand what you've done to this family?" he spat. I looked him in the eye and said words I never thought I'd have the courage to. "I didn't do anything to this family. I just stopped covering for it." His face went pale, and for the first time in my life, my father had no response. He turned and left without another word, and that silence was louder than any scream. My mother followed days later, her visit less explosive, more desperate. She begged me to think of appearances, to consider the long-term damage, to stop airing private matters in public. Private matters. That was the phrase she clung to, the shield she always used to hide behind while my life was dissected, criticized, dismissed. I let her talk, her voice trembling, her manicured hands clutching her purse as though holding it tight could keep her world intact. When she finally paused, waiting for me to promise something, anything, I only said, "You taught me appearances were everything. Now you're just living with the appearance you created." She looked at me like she didn't recognize me, like the daughter she thought she could mold had been replaced by a stranger. But the truth was, I had always been here. She just never wanted to see me. Word of our confrontation spread. Relatives who had been silent for years started calling me, some with apologies, some with blame, all with the same disbelief that I had been the one to stand against them. But I didn't need their validation. I wasn't looking for allies. This wasn't about revenge for me anymore. It was about freedom, and freedom never asks for permission. And as I lay in bed one night, scrolling through the flood of messages, I realized something that made my chest ache with both sorrow and power. I had finally become untouchable. Not because they couldn't hurt me anymore, but because I no longer cared if they tried. The silence that followed my refusal to bend didn't last long, because people like my parents don't know how to live without control. They tried to rebuild their image brick by brick, but every time they laid one down, another crack opened. My father attempted to spin the scandal as a misunderstanding, whispering to colleagues that the letter was fake, that I had fabricated everything out of jealousy. But the problem with lies is that they demand evidence, and he couldn't provide any. The handwriting was undeniable, the timeline damning, and whispers turned into questions he couldn't answer. His company lost one of its biggest contracts, millions slipping through his hands in a single boardroom vote. He came home furious, slamming doors, shouting into phones, but for the first time in his life, his anger had nowhere to land because I wasn't there to absorb it. My mother retreated into her shell of vanity, trying to plaster smiles across her face at every event she still managed to get invited to, but the photos betrayed her. The glow she had once worn like armor was gone, and people noticed. They always notice. And my brother, stripped of his golden child status, drifted through the ruins of what was left. He came to me one evening, standing on my doorstep with a face that looked older than it should have, as though the weight of truth had finally bent him. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just asked, voice quiet and broken, "Why didn't you tell me before? Why did you wait until then?" I stared at him, the brother I had once adored, the boy who used to pull my hand on the playground and swear he'd never let me fall, now a man who had chosen silence every time our parents cut me down. And I told him the only answer that mattered, because you wouldn't have listened. Not until it hurt you. He flinched, like I had struck him, and maybe I had, but words have a way of carving deeper than fists. He left without saying another word, and I knew then that the bond we once had was gone, not because I had broken it, but because he had chosen long ago to let it wither. And yet, despite the destruction, despite the distance, they still tried to pull me back into their orbit. My father sent legal threats, claiming defamation, demanding I return documents that never belonged to me. I laughed when I read them because they weren't real threats. They were desperation on paper. My mother tried guilt, sending letters handwritten in her perfect cursive, calling me her darling daughter, words she hadn't used since I was a child, as though ink on a page could erase decades of neglect. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Their power was crumbling because it had always depended on my silence, and I had finally taken that away. Meanwhile, the world I was building without them began to take shape. I poured my energy into my work, into friendships that weren't transactional, into moments of peace I hadn't known I was capable of. And slowly I realized that the revenge I thought I wanted had never been about destroying them. It had been about reclaiming me. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't defined by the family who mocked me or the brother whose shadow I lived in. I was defined by my choice to stand, to speak, to walk away. And as their world continued to unravel, mine was only just beginning to rise. Weeks turned into months, and what began as a scandal whispered in corners had grown into a shadow my parents couldn't outrun. My father's empire, the one he worshipped more than his own family, collapsed faster than even I could have predicted. Investors pulled out one by one, lawsuits piled up, and the name that had once been spoken with admiration became a cautionary tale. He sold cars, then properties, liquidating piece by piece, yet no amount of damage control could restore the trust he had lost. My mother drifted beside him like a ghost, her perfectly curated image rotting from the inside out. Women who used to cling to her at charity galas now avoided her, afraid the stench of scandal might stick to their gowns. And every time she passed me on the street, because yes, she still tried to haunt the same shops, the same cafes, her eyes darted away, unable to hold mine. For the first time, she was the one shrinking. My brother disappeared into silence, moving into a small apartment across town after the annulment finalized. The boy who once had everything now lived in bare rooms with peeling wallpaper, and though part of me wanted to pity him, another part remembered every time he had stayed silent while I was humiliated. Silence was a choice, and he had made his. I didn't reach out. Instead, I focused on the quiet bloom of my own life. I started therapy, peeling back years of wounds I had carried alone. I made friends who saw me not as someone's daughter or someone's sister, but as myself. For the first time, I laughed without checking if someone was rolling their eyes. I spoke without waiting to be interrupted. I existed without apology. And yet, even as I built this new world, the old one tried to claw back at me. One night, well past midnight, my phone lit up with my father's number. I almost ignored it, but something, curiosity maybe, made me answer. His voice was unrecognizable, cracked, fragile. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just said, "I've lost everything." The silence that followed was heavy, but not for me. For once, it was his silence to carry. I let the weight of his words hang before I replied, calmly, "Now you know what it feels like." And then I ended the call. He didn't try again. That moment shifted something in me. I realized I didn't need their downfall to feel whole. I already was. Their destruction was never my victory. My victory was stepping out of the shadows they had built around me and refusing to step back in. And yet fate has a way of writing its own epilogues. A year after the wedding that never was, I heard from a distant cousin that my parents had put their house on the market, the mansion they once paraded as proof of their success. The walls that had echoed with their mockery, their dismissals, their cold silences, now stood empty. And I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel guilt. I felt nothing at all. Because that house was never my home. My home was the life I had finally claimed. The future they never thought I'd have the courage to build. By the time a full year had passed since the wedding, it wasn't just their empire that had crumbled, it was the illusion of who they were. The family that had once strutted through town as if untouchable now lived in the shadows, avoiding glances, dodging conversations, reduced to whispers in the mouths of people who used to bow to them. My father, once the man who commanded boardrooms with a single look, had aged a decade in 12 months, his shoulders bent, his eyes dull, his voice stripped of authority. I saw him once, standing in line at the bank like everyone else, no assistants, no entourage, just a man holding paperwork with trembling hands. He glanced at me but didn't say a word, and for the first time I saw not my father, but a man who had built his kingdom on sand and watched the tide take it all. My mother fared no better. She clung to the remnants of her social circle, but they treated her like a liability, inviting her only out of pity, not respect. I watched from afar as she tried to smile through brittle conversations, her laughter ringing hollow, her eyes darting toward doors as if escape was the only comfort left. And my brother was the hardest to see. He came to me again, months after everything, no longer angry, no longer broken, just quiet. He stood at my door with a small box in his hands, the wedding band he never got to wear, the one he said he couldn't bear to keep. He pressed it into my palm and whispered, "I wish I had believed you sooner." There was no fight left in him, no denial, just regret, and while a part of me wanted to forgive him, another part knew forgiveness was not mine to give. It was something he had to find within himself. I closed the door gently that night, and for the first time I felt the full weight of what I had done, not with guilt, but with certainty. They had mocked me, erased me, told me I wasn't enough, and I had shown them the cost of underestimating the daughter they tried to silence. But in their downfall, I found something greater than revenge: peace. Peace in knowing that their voices no longer defined me. Peace in realizing that I had built a life that didn't need their approval. Peace in finally standing on my own. Still, sometimes late at night, I think back to that moment in the kitchen when my mother's words cut through me like glass. "It's better if you're not there." And I smile now, because she was right in a way she never understood. I wasn't there, not in the way they wanted me to be. I wasn't a silent shadow, a scapegoat, a discarded daughter. I was the storm they never saw coming, the truth they couldn't bury, the reckoning that tore through their perfect facade. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. As the second year crept closer, the distance between who I had been and who I had become grew wider, like a canyon that could never be crossed again. My parents still tried, in small and pathetic ways, to claw back what they had lost. A holiday card arrived in the mail, carefully chosen with gold lettering and scripted wishes for peace, signed with both their names as though the fractures hadn't happened. I stared at it for a long time, the forced cheerfulness of it almost laughable, before sliding it into a drawer without reply. They didn't want reconciliation, they wanted erasure, the kind where the past is smoothed over like wrinkles beneath makeup, but the cracks remain underneath. My father's downfall continued in slow motion. His bankruptcy filing splashed across the local papers. The man who once barked orders now shuffled through town with the weight of public failure pressing down on him, his suits worn, his gaze empty. He had mocked me for years as if my existence was a flaw in his perfect empire, but now he was the one people avoided, the one whispered about. My mother still walked with her chin high, but the gloss had worn off. Every hair out of place, every forced smile betrayed her desperation to hold on to a world that no longer wanted her. They were living in the ruins, and I was watching from a distance with a clarity I had never known. My brother was the only one who reached for me with something real. He didn't call often, but when he did, it wasn't to beg or accuse, it was to share silence, to let me know he was still breathing, still trying to piece himself together. I didn't open my arms fully, but I didn't shut the door either, because unlike our parents, he was capable of change, and maybe someday that would be enough. For me, life had shifted entirely. I had started traveling, seeing places they had mocked as unnecessary distractions, soaking in colors and cultures they would have dismissed as frivolous. Every photo I took, every laugh I shared with new friends, felt like reclaiming pieces of myself they had stolen. And yet, sometimes late at night when the world was still, I felt the echoes of their voices in the back of my mind, mocking, dismissing, cutting. But those echoes no longer had teeth. They were ghosts of a past I had buried beneath layers of truth. And I realized something important. Revenge wasn't a single moment, a toast at a wedding or a letter placed on a table. Revenge was living fully, boldly, unapologetically in the light they had always tried to deny me. It was every step I took without their approval, every breath I drew without their control, every smile that bloomed on my face without their permission. They had told me not to be there. And in a way, they were right. I wasn't there anymore. Not in their world, not in their lies, not in their cage. I had left, and I wasn't coming back. Time has a way of stripping everything down to its bones. And by the third year after that wedding that never was, the people who once towered over me like giants were barely recognizable. My father lived in a cramped rental on the edge of town. A man who had once owned half the skyline now reduced to signing unemployment checks and battling creditors who no longer answered his calls. I saw him once at the grocery store, pushing a cart with dented cans and off-brand cereal, his once perfectly tailored suits replaced with a worn jacket that hung too loose on his shoulders. He caught my eye, and for a second I thought he might approach, might try to claw back some piece of dignity through confrontation, but instead he turned away, pretending to study a shelf he couldn't afford. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just defeated, he was hollow. My mother had fared no better. Her friends had all but vanished, her social calendar empty, her days filled with long walks through streets where no one greeted her anymore. I heard she had tried to volunteer at a local event, desperate to be seen, only to be politely told her presence would be a distraction. For a woman who had once built her identity on appearances, on being the center of every room, the exile was a punishment harsher than anything I could have planned. And yet, despite their ruin, they still tried to rewrite the story. Rumors surfaced that they told anyone who would listen that I had betrayed them, that I had fabricated lies to destroy their happiness. But the beauty of truth is that it doesn't need defending. It lingers, undeniable, while lies crumble under their own weight. No one believed them anymore. My brother, though, was different. He carried the heaviest burden, because unlike them, he had glimpsed the truth and couldn't escape it. He worked odd jobs now, stripped of the career opportunities my father once handed him like candy, and each time I saw him he looked smaller, as if the golden glow he had been wrapped in had finally burned away. He spoke to me sometimes, quietly, carefully, as though each word might shatter the fragile bridge between us. And in those moments I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for the boy he had been, relief that he was no longer blind. But I kept my distance, because distance was the only way to keep myself whole. And through it all, I grew. I moved into a place of my own, decorated with colors they would have sneered at, filled with laughter they would have silenced. I started writing, pages and pages of memories, of truths, of the kind of wounds that only heal when exposed to the light. I didn't publish them, not yet, but even writing was liberation, a way of owning a story they had tried to erase. And in quiet moments when the city hummed around me, I felt the kind of peace that comes only after surviving a storm. But make no mistake, peace did not mean forgetting. Every cruel word, every mocking glance, every time they told me I was less, it all lived inside me still, not as wounds, but as armor. Because the girl they had tried to silence was gone, and in her place stood a woman they would never be able to break again. Years later, the story of that wedding still lingered in whispers, but no longer as a scandal. It had become a lesson people repeated quietly when they thought no one was listening. A cautionary tale about what happens when a family builds itself on appearances instead of truth. My parents faded into irrelevance, their names stripped of power, their voices no longer carrying weight in any room. My father spent his days shuffling through court dates and paperwork, his empire reduced to numbers on a page that never balanced. The man who once mocked me for being a disappointment had become a man defined entirely by his own failures, and the cruel irony was that he knew it. I heard from a distant relative that he rarely spoke anymore, that his pride had withered along with his fortune, and in that silence I recognized the justice I had been denied for so long. My mother, too, lived her punishment every day. She still tried to cling to fragments of the life she had once paraded, dressing up for trips to the market, forcing smiles when no one looked her way, but there was no stage left for her to perform on. Without an audience, her entire identity unraveled. I passed her once in town, her eyes meeting mine across the street, and in that moment, I saw not the woman who had mocked me, who had told me I was better unseen, but a woman broken by the collapse of her own illusions. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came, and I walked on without pausing, because nothing she could say would matter anymore. My brother, however, was different. Time had humbled him in ways I never expected. He had built a quiet life of his own, working honestly, surviving without the privileges that had once cushioned his every step. He reached out from time to time, not with excuses or apologies, but with a kind of steady sincerity that told me he had changed. I didn't rush to forgive him, but I didn't shut him out either. Some wounds take longer to heal than others, but at least he no longer pretended they weren't there. And as for me, I had built something I never thought possible. A life defined not by their shadows but by my light. I found success on my own terms, not measured in mansions or contracts, but in freedom, in laughter, in nights spent with people who saw me as enough without conditions. I traveled, I wrote, I created. I stood on stages of my own choosing and spoke truths that resonated with women who had been told their voices didn't matter. And every time someone whispered thank you after hearing my story, I knew that the silence I had once carried had been transformed into something powerful. The irony is that my parents had been right in one sense. It really was better if I wasn't there. Better for me. Better for the woman I became. Because in choosing not to stand beside them on that wedding day, in choosing instead to pull back the curtain and let the truth burn through their facade, I had freed myself from a lifetime of being unseen. And though they may never forgive me, I no longer needed their forgiveness. My peace didn't come from them, it came from walking away. Now, when I look back at everything, the kitchen table where they mocked me, the church where I stood in silence, the reception hall where I laid their secrets bare, I don't see a family I lost. I see a life I saved, mine, and I wonder, as I close this chapter and step fully into the next, was I too harsh in exposing them the way I did? Or was it the only way to finally claim the voice they never wanted me to have? What do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough?